Emerging research is challenging everything that we've known about depression, anxiety, ADHD, even addiction recovery. Welcome to this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Aimie. I have a scientist with me today, and we've already been geeking out about these concepts that we're going to share around not just dopamine, but really, are there different phenotypes of mental health? Or is anxiety all the same anxiety? Depression all the same depression? So while we can go down the route of siloed medicine and say, well, it's a serotonin problem or it's a dopamine problem and here's a medication for that. What if it's so much more? What if it is this metabolic footprint where we can actually know a lot about you and why you have depression and anxiety or difficulty focusing in relationship to your sugar levels, to what your insulin is doing. This is what we're talking about today, and I'm so excited to have my guest with me here, Dr. Bills. Now, Dr. Bills and I met specifically around a product that you have developed that enhances the nervous system and specific aspects around dopamine. But your research covers so much more, and that's what I want to dive in with you today. So thank you for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Me too. I appreciate you having me. This is going to be fun.
This is. So now to give people context of who you are a neuroscientist. You are Associate Dean for Research at Norda College of Osteopathic Medicine and Chief Scientific Officer at NeuroNova. Tell us what that means and tell us about some of the research that you've been doing. And I want to get into the paper that just came out, but let's start with your NIH-funded research on dopamine, first of all.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, we started this research years ago, and back then I was working in an addiction laboratory, and so we were very much focused on trying to understand mechanisms of addiction and trying to understand dopamine dynamics. We focused a lot on dopamine release in the mesolimbic system, what caused its release. What were the neurochemical alterations that happened from a variety of different drugs of abuse? And then what we were particularly interested in is, well, how can we try to restore some of that circuitry after it's been altered by drugs of abuse over time? And we were particularly interested if there were some non-invasive ways to do this. And so the research started years ago where we started to work in some of those areas. And it started with we got some NIH funding to look initially at some of the mechanisms actually of acupuncture. And so that was a grant that we got years ago. It was to try to understand what were the neurological pathways that govern some particular types of acupuncture intervention. So that was funded by the NCCIH division of the NIH. And we'd also made some observations clinically years ago when we were working in pain management, that some of the patients that had been really kind of using opiates for pain control, when it was time to stop taking the opiates and they found that there's some dependence had been kind of garnered because of the length of usage, they would report that physical interventions would reduce their anxiety levels when they were reducing kind of the dosing of the opiates. And so that kind of echo of a memory of that happening clinically kind of led us to hypothesize that maybe there were some peripheral reasons that was happening that drove some central changes. And so we started to kind of think, well, maybe there are some nerve endings out in the periphery that have some central pathways that affect this dopamine system. And so I guess the non-boring, making a long story short, was we started to run experiments where we could actually do surgical implants into the spine and then activate peripheral nerve receptors at certain frequencies and durations. And then we could put electrodes in the brain and measure what was happening in the brain with these different stimuli. And it turned out that there actually were some peripheral nerve pathways. For those that want the annoyingly in-depth answer, it turns out that there's a pathway called the dorsal column medial lemniscus. And it goes up and the first nerve travels up the spine and it ends in the brainstem. And then from there, another neuron goes up to another part of the brain that's called the thalamus. And this is known. We've known this for a long, long time. But from there, traditionally, we know that it then goes up to the conscious part of the parietal lobe where we sense that we've been touched or that there's been pressure or something of that sort. And that's what we knew. But it turns out that there's actually another pathway. There's other fibers that shoot off into this dopamine system. And that we didn't know before. And it turns out that you can activate some of these certain types of mechanically sensitive nerves out in the peripheral parts of your body. And if you do it at just the right frequencies, it will actually cause dopamine to be released within the brain. And so that was one of the kind of the early breakthroughs that led us to kind of go down this route was finding that there was this non-canonical pathway that fed into this dopamine system. And so we published that back in end of 2019, that there was this other pathway that could do that. And so from there, that led to a variety of experimentation where we started to look at, well, if we can change dopamine levels, does that mean we can affect how drugs of abuse are changing the brain? And so we measured it in terms of ethanol. We measured it in terms of morphine. And it turned out that it did. We could actually change the way those drugs altered the brain if we stimulated those pathways simultaneously. And then we measured, well, can we start to treat some of the effects of these drugs? Like during withdrawal, can we reduce anxiety? And it turned out that it worked. And so we published a series of papers in the subsequent years showing that could be done. And that led to some work of saying, well, boy, we don't want this to be a surgical implant. And so we worked with some more colleagues to develop a non-invasive way to get this certain frequency into the spine. And that led to kind of the device that lets us stimulate the spine and cause a release of dopamine. And so the NIH funded our phase 1 clinical trial a few years back, which we published. And now we're kind of waiting to start a phase 2 trial to really kind of elucidate exactly how this is going to work, but it's so far so good.
Yeah, you and I have had that conversation of maybe my people, maybe my group that work with me are part of that cohort, because I'm getting them on this seat whenever they come to work with me in my home for the workshops. Now, as I think back on my process for why I went into addiction medicine, it was because I saw that if I really wanted to learn how to work with a nervous system that had been so adapted to its environment, that it was not going to be just an easy fix to say, oh, well, just choose to do something differently. Yeah. It was going to be the addiction population. And now I've taken that and I've said, well, how do I work with people who this has been their trauma patterns? Maybe anxiety, maybe depression, maybe it's people pleasing, maybe it's perfectionism, but this has been their pattern for decades. Just like the addiction medicine patients often were taking opiates or downers for decades. And it does not matter whether it's the addiction substance or people pleasing and perfectionism. When we take those away, the anxiety, Dr. Bills, the anxiety is what makes them decide, I don't think I actually want to change. Let me just live the rest of my life this way, even though it's not how I would want to, but I cannot go through that level of anxiety that one experiences with the withdrawals of their substance or their behavior that has been a survival mechanism for them. So then here you come along and you say, oh, well, we actually have the science to make that anxiety more tolerable. We actually have the science to show why some of this anxiety and what we can do about it has the outcome, the actual intervention surprised you in its effectiveness.
Well, certainly. I think, we kind of talked about this for a minute before, but, from a scientist perspective, like we're skeptical of everything all the time.
Yes, and we are.
To some point, even when you have data that says this works, you're like, really? Okay. All right. Well,
let me test again.
Let's prove it again and again. And to be honest, we like when we ran those first experiments where we were showing that we could alter the way alcohol was causing adaptation in the brain. Like we were like, no, that can't be real. That's not real. Like that's not supposed to do it. And so we repeated those experiments 3 different times because we thought we're not publishing this. This doesn't make any sense. And like, this is not supposed to do this. And so we did it 3 different times like that. It took us probably a year longer than it should have before that paper came out because we were like, no, not real, unacceptable. That's not the way this works. That's not in the book.
It's not in the book.
And it just kept working until finally, almost from a moral standpoint, we were like, well, we have to publish it. Like it's clearly working at this point. And so we're going to publish it. And so, yeah, no, I think all the time we're like, oh my gosh, I guess the data is the data, right? It seems to be doing that. But I loved your explanation of that. I remember a mentor early on when I was really getting into studying, mechanisms of addiction. And one of the ways that they described this anxiety that shows up when the withdrawal hits which really resonated with me, is they said, did you ever get held under the water in a pool as a kid? And I remember, I was like, yeah, I remember that. Like that was terrible. And they said, you remember the panic that you felt? Just that, like, you'd do anything to get out of the water. You'd take swings at people. You'd do anything it took because every part of your system is saying you have to breathe or you're going to die. And they said, when you meet with the first patient that's in the midst of withdrawal, remember, that's how they feel every second, all the time, until they get more of the drug. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, all right. Years ago, there was the debate, like, okay, is an addiction a disease or a choice? That was a thing for a long time that people got into, and that really helped me kind of understand, like, there is a disease process that's happening here, and we can't just pretend like, okay, well, square your shoulders and you'll be fine, right? Like, there's a lot going on here that we need to understand better to get there. And dopamine is critical to this, right? It's a critical piece to understanding why the brain is doing what it's doing. And I think it's a misunderstood piece, by the way.
Hugely misunderstood, because I think that most people understand that there is this connection between addiction and dopamine and that somehow it hijacks it. But dopamine is very misunderstood. So how would a person know that they have low dopamine activity, and what would they expect to feel like if they use your intervention, for example, and they get that dopamine activity? What can they expect to feel from that?
Yeah, dopamine's a fascinating neurotransmitter because it's really quite nuanced, actually, what it does and how it works. And so, if someone's not in the throes of withdrawal, then traditionally we wouldn't say that they necessarily have low dopamine. Now, there's a lot of metabolites and testing and things where we make kind of indirect commentaries and whatnot, but maybe a good way to think of dopamine is almost a little bit morally agnostic. Dopamine isn't good or bad per se. It depends, right? And so dopamine is context dependent. And so dopamine is maybe a quick dispelling is dopamine doesn't necessarily make you feel good, and it doesn't make you feel bad necessarily. Now, if you deplete someone's dopamine, they're going to feel like garbage. But if you deplete pretty much any neurotransmitter, you're going to feel like garbage, right? That's probably fair. And so if somebody broke into my office right now and just walloped me in the mouth, I would actually get a dopamine release. Even though I'm petrified and in pain, dopamine would get released in my brain. Same if somebody burst in and gave me a big hug, right? Because dopamine is a signal, it's a cue that the brain uses in some sense in the circuit we're talking about anyway. There's a few dopamine circuits, but in this mesolimbic system, dopamine is the cue to tell you that you have experienced something you didn't properly anticipate, and it primes the brain to change and to learn. And so from a scientific perspective, we would say that some of the driving forces behind dopamine release are experiences that are novel, which means kind of new or unexpected or unanticipated, or salient. meaning they're potent or particularly strong, right?
Mhm.
And so those two categories of experiences will cause the brain to say, okay, you didn't predict that quite right. And so it says dopamine. And then the dopamine goes out and it primes a whole bunch of different circuits so that they can lock in the circumstances of what has occurred and kind of, in a metaphorical way, change the lens through which we perceive reality, in which we predict the future, so that we can make a better prediction the next time based upon the new data that's come in. And so dopamine is critical to learning, to change, to growing, to changing the way we perceive and predict things.
Right. You know, as I walk through the body's trauma response in my book, The Biology of Trauma, dopamine is right at the center of that, because as you are experiencing something that is so significant that it's creating this overwhelm and cellular dimming down and hibernation shutdown, that's your dopamine moment of, this was really significant.
Yeah.
And we need to remember this, and we need to create these associations so that it is a meaning that stays with us, and we remember next time that this means this, and thus do this. It's that neurotransmitter that helps take meaning into movement and action and doing something different.
And you did such a good job, I think, in your book, The Biology of Trauma, of describing that process and some of that, which was phenomenal. It's if you want a good explanation of kind of what happens in the body, that's a great place to go for that. But yeah, dopamine is a curious thing, and like in your example, boy, if you want, a particularly traumatic experience is obviously novel, and it's obviously salient, right? It has this perfect storm of all of those to the extreme, and that huge release of dopamine that occurs in that terribly traumatic moment, it takes in all the circumstances around the experience, and it locks it into this predictive model, like this new prescription lens to your glasses, so that now you've got this new prescription on, and that's how you're now seeing the world around you, and it can help you. Well, it's designed to help you predict danger, because you didn't predict it the first time properly to escape. And now your predictions can be correct or incorrect or any variation thereof, right? It depends.
That's chapter 11, the lens that we have, and how much of that is formed by our early life.
Yeah.
And that is what I've also seen, is that especially children who've had a lot of trauma. I worked with kids who were adopted and then sent to another country to be adopted by their family. And so their whole early life, probably starting in utero, Dr. Bills, was all this, I don't know if I'm going to survive. I don't know if I'm going to be okay. The world seems like a very dangerous place, and I haven't even entered into the world yet. And so their whole dopamine system is plugged in to always be making meaning out of everything.
Yeah.
And then it's like it reaches an exhaustion phase. And now, in order to feel normal, they have to create stress and drama to get the adrenaline to have that dopamine effect. And so now you have what people might call like an adrenaline junkie. An adrenaline junkie sometimes is actually a dopamine junkie, because they're not having the same amount of dopamine that they may have had at previous times in their life. And the body seeks dopamine. The body needs that healthy amount of dopamine.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. And, that some of the interplays are, I think, really quite fascinating with that, because you've got these interesting systems that interact in this. And so one of them is you have the hypothalamus, which is one part of the hypothalamus is responsible for the unconscious emotional output from all these experiences. And that feeds down and has interactions with our adrenal glands. It has interactions with epinephrine and norepinephrine and some of these neurotransmitters and circulating hormones. But boy, you talk about kind of this fatigue and this burnout that can show up with this hypervigilant state of constantly predicting some danger, that produces eventually this flat affect that then requires us to go out and seek, and, in extreme cases, self-injury and, dangerous behaviors like you mentioned, and things like that. Another interesting part, I think, is there's this in the prefrontal cortex, in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that is this, I think, this beautifully human part of the brain. It's quite unique to humans, actually. And I think one of the most, in my opinion, one of the more divine aspects of the human mind. But it's the part where we can create, almost worlds without end. It's the part where you can lay in bed at night and you can imagine a conversation you had with somebody, and then within 30 minutes you've lived out a lifetime in your own mind about what that conversation, what it means and the implications of it. And sometimes they end triumphantly, and other times we're, drunk alone in a ditch covered in cats, and it's terrible and I might as well give up, and all these things. But and the reality is all this has occurred. It's not real. It's happened in our own mind. But the lens through which we create those iterative futures, those straw people, like these fake us's, the lens is created by dopamine. And dopamine is responsible for changing that lens over time, so that when we go silent in our own minds and we start to iterate the future and derive meaning from reliving the past, that's the prescription lens through which we look in order to create this fake us that we let live and experience. And it's a critical piece.
It is a critical piece. And this is where I'm kind of coming back to the conversation that we've had right before hitting record button, which was this idea of the underlying biochemistry and biology or neurochemistry is so vast and interesting that a person would not normally know that they have this, what we in science call phenotypes. And what you're experiencing is a specific phenotype of dopamine. Really not just dopamine, right? But like the whole soup of your neurochemistry and hormones and how that all comes together to create your unique experience of your world, your health issues, your mental health. And it's not just dopamine then, because in your research, you've really been also digging into these other aspects around a phenotype and how your sugar levels actually can be playing a big role in the presentation of your mental health. And so before we just reach for that antidepressant, or we let someone prescribe us an antidepressant, what if we actually paused and said, what is going on in my physiology soup that is creating this at this time in my life, and in this maybe sometimes even the time of day that I seem to always get anxious? So this is the time when I'd love for you to toot your own horn and tell us about this latest paper that just came out, because I think this is fascinating, and I see that this is the future of trauma therapy.
Oh man, well, that's a kind introduction there to a paper we just published. But we started looking at kind of this broader context when we've been specifically, we're looking at migraines. And so here at the medical school, we run the chronic migraine clinic, the chronic migraine research clinic. And a few things emerged and became obvious. We work with a lot of local docs that are amazing and wonderful. And we kind of became the overflow clinic for everyone that doesn't respond. And so just everyone that's having chronic migraine, which definitionally I think is important, that means they're having a minimum of 15 days per month. But most of the people that came were having 3 to 4 migraines a week. I mean, that was the cadence that they're on. And they've been on every medication that we have that's FDA approved to treat migraine. And they've been, many of them, decades of trying to work through this. And so when we started gathering all the data and looking at, okay, well, what's going on? And a few things emerged, which are, there were a lot of comorbidities. We ran a lot of neuropsychological evaluations. And so a few things emerged. One is there's a very particular cognitive profile of a chronic migraine patient. Now, anytime you say this, I got a caveat with, I'm speaking in generalities based upon data. Not any given individual falls perfectly within the data set, but I'm going to report on kind of the statistically significant averages. But what emerged was an individual who has higher than normal deductive reasoning ability. They had higher than normal working memory and spatial short-term memory. So in other words, maybe to translate that, you've got someone who's more intelligent than the average person. They have a higher IQ than normal. And they're very aware of everything that's going on around them all the time. And they're very able to make inferences about what it means. Interesting little dopamine connection there. But then when we went down to another domain that's we call response inhibition. So this is a part of the brain that allows someone to ignore noise or not to be bothered by distraction, those types of things. Their response inhibition had dropped significantly. And so now you've got somebody that's prone to jump to negative affective conclusions. They're highly capable of making inferences and very aware of everything happening all the time. And so we looked at those data and we're like, oh my goodness, we couldn't design a way to feel more anxiety in this world than that cognitive profile, right? And so we thought, well, wait a minute, what's happening here? Is this because that's a cognitive profile that predicts the onset of migraine? Or is this a result of migraine? Or is there something else going on that interplays? And so, okay, so this is a really long story. I hope I'm not boring here with this, but what we started to look at was another aspect is people would report that if they didn't eat, they would get migraine, right? And that they were prone to hanger, to be a little colloquial on that. But if I don't eat, I get a little bit snippy, a little bit irritable. And so we started to think we clearly don't have a big enough picture about what's really going on here. And so maybe taking a half a step back, traditionally in healthcare, for those that aren't familiar with this, well, everybody's familiar with this, we have this terrible habit of ordering like a series of tests at one moment in time. Like we say, okay, blood test or image. And then we get a report back that says this was the state of someone's physiology at 7:35 a.m. on October 23rd of this year. And then we say, okay, well, this is you. This represents the totality of you. And so we're going to make a year's worth of health decisions based upon this very thin slice of who you are as a person and what's going on in your life. And we don't worry about anything, really. We're like, oh, were you stressed? Oh, did you have a giant fight with your spouse before you walked into that clinic? Like, oh, what part of your menstrual cycle were you on in the moment we ordered all of this testing? Oh, you just lost your job 2 days before. Oh, okay, well, we don't care. This is still your data, right? This is still you. And so we started to say that there's got to be a better way to look at this. We need continuous data to understand what's happening. And so we started to order glucose tolerance testing to see how people were responding to glucose. And boy, this pattern emerged where people would respond after a glucose load by dropping into a hypoglycemic state, like severe. Some people were dropping like down into the low 40s after a load of glucose, which if you don't know what that means, that's like the lab calls me in a panic and they're like, your patient is dying. What do you want us to do right now? And you're like, okay. The first time it happened, I was like, I admit them. Like, I don't know what's going on. Like, this is what's happening. But then after like the 35th time it happened, I was like, oh, they're going to be fine. They've been living like that for 20 years. And it's okay. It's not okay, but it's become their norm. And so then we started to put continuous glucose monitors on them. Well, an interesting thing occurred. We had a particular case study that we did where somebody brought in a particular patient who'd been admitted to a psychiatric unit 4 times on suicide watch. And they had a bunch of positive biomarkers, including a positive ANA and a few other things. And we published this case study a little bit ago. But when we did an analysis, they were falling into the pattern we were seeing in these migraine patients. And so we put a continuous glucose monitor on this patient and found that they had unbelievable glucose dysregulation with huge, massive swings. And so we sat down and said, okay, well, we're going to put them on a ketogenic diet. And so we put them on a ketogenic diet for 3 months. And after 3 months, their psychiatric symptoms cleared up and they no longer had a positive ANA. And so we sent them back to their provider and said, all right, here's what we're finding. And their other provider progressively took them off of all of their psychiatric medications, and undiagnosed them with some of those conditions. We didn't do that. We sent them back because we're like, hey, listen, we're going to collaborate on this. And so that was remarkable enough that we published that as a case study a bit ago. And then we started to notice the same trend with the anxiety and the depression levels of these chronic migraine patients. And so we started to intervene to deal with underlying metabolic conditions, and started to find that it was resolving some of the anxiety. It was resolving some of the migraine issues that they were experiencing. And so we just published a study just about 3 days ago in Frontiers in Neurology, specifically about trying to characterize chronic migraine in terms of glucose phenotypes. And we did some clustering analysis of okay, here's what seems to have emerged. And then we took all of the treatments that had worked for them and did kind of a post hoc superimposition based upon which glucose phenotype. And the point of the study wasn't that we've discovered some singular source of truth of the cause of all things, but the suggestion that maybe this is a new line of inquiry that we can start to say, okay, on these patients that just don't respond, maybe we're missing something. Maybe there's more to what's going on than just this singular snapshot of neurology that's the traditional way we've looked at healthcare.
And what's fascinating is that this is something that can be applied to so many other conditions, not just migraines. And as I hear you talk, I'm thinking about when I was diagnosed with autoimmunity, because my ANA levels were very high. So for those listening who may not be familiar with that term, ANA is one of the more common markers for autoimmunity. It's actually an antibody that attacks your own nucleus. Talk about trauma. Your very core is being attacked, your DNA. And it's one of the measures that we can see. Your body's headed towards autoimmunity, even if you don't have that diagnosis. And it's a way for us to measure and track, is your biology coming back into safety and out of that biology of trauma? And so I'm looking at women, especially, we know that women who've experienced a lot of trauma in their lifetime that's unresolved, they experience worse menopausal transition. We know this. The adverse childhood experiences studies have shown this over and over again. So we know the science is there. We know that there's some correlation, but we haven't known the mechanism. And for me, I think that, no, this is the mechanism. And so that's why I'm leaning into, let me start measuring the sugar levels continuously. Let me start measuring these labs, because I think that the answer will all be in their unique footprint of their biology, and that it actually is a phenotype that's been developing over decades, and it's just surfacing with the changes that happen in the hormones. And it's very interesting to me that so many women in that perimenopause age are coming down with new conditions, whether that's autoimmunity, whether that's psoriasis or skin issues, digestive issues. That's when things often start falling apart. They think it's just because they're getting old. And I'm saying, no, like this is the phenotype, and it was actually quite predictable. And we can both prevent it if we can see this ahead of time. But then there's also so much that we can do when you're still in the middle of it for us to create a different pathway for your nervous system and your body to go.
Totally. And other great scientists have done work and published wonderful studies, specifically looking at the interaction between glucose dysregulation and markers of autoimmunity. So some of those studies have been around for a long time. We've known that there's a connection between those. And boy, the other we know that fluctuating hormone levels drastically change the way our body metabolizes glucose. And for those that might not be as familiar, glucose is a critical molecule. You know, we talk about blood sugar and we think instantly of diabetes, But that's this one prong of, some way that it went wrong. I mean, interestingly, the brain traditionally only really wants glucose. There's really only two fuels the brain will use for energy. It'll use glucose and it'll use ketones. I mean, in the end, that's pretty much it. And it's actually a genius design, really, because the brain is made of fat and protein. And so, even in a starvation state, the brain isn't even capable. It doesn't even have the machinery to break itself down in order to fuel itself. And so it's a beautiful little design to safeguard that's in the system. But the regulation of blood sugar levels is built into every single cell in the body. And we think of the pancreas and insulin as this critical tool, which it absolutely is. But we've also got in the brain this part called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus it lives kind of right on the edge where the blood-brain barrier is amongst the thinnest parts of the brain. And so it can, in a sense, it can monitor blood sugar levels. And there's one particular nucleus in there that's called the arcuate nucleus. And the arcuate nucleus is particularly important for regulating some of this. And the arcuate nucleus has these glucose excitatory and glucose inhibitory neurons. And so depending on what happens, it'll send off different cascading signals through the autonomic system and through the endocrine system in order to help kind of regulate this. But it's quite common to get some dysregulation. Trauma in particular is very hypothalamic. The output of kind of this unconscious emotional response to trauma, it all comes through the hypothalamus, because any physiological change that we experience that starts with a mental thought, it has to go through the hypothalamus in order to get into the endocrine or the hormone system, and then down through the autonomics like sympathetic, parasympathetic. And there's great connections between this arcuate, another called the ventral medial hypothalamus, between these little subnuclei and these output systems that run both kind of our hormones and our autonomics. So glucose is critically important to understanding why our body does what it does.
Well, and for me, I also see that it creates our resilience capacity. And so in my book, in chapter 4, where I'm talking about the stress response of a cell, and when it shifts to that trauma response, completely different physiology, that is also determined by our glucose. Because in the stress response, we have to upregulate our energy production. We have a danger, there's an active problem, we've got to run away from this tiger. But what if I don't have enough sugar? What if I don't have enough glucose to make the amount of ATP that I need to run away from this tiger? That's my resilience capacity. I can only run as fast as I have the cellular resources to do so, as my body's able to mobilize that glucose. And so you take someone who's hypoglycemic, their blood sugar levels are low, it's already telling their hypothalamus, everything right now is going to be too hard for you. Everything is going to be too hard. That email, definitely too hard. Yeah. Responding to that text message, yeah, that's definitely going to take too much energy. You don't have that energy because we're low on glucose. And so it actually creates the very overwhelm of a trauma response simply because a person's blood sugar levels are low.
Totally. And when the trauma response or the stress response is functioning normally, when it's not in this chronic state, you get this sympathetic nervous system release that downstream causes the release of things like cortisol and a few, this cascade of different chemicals that get released. And one of the effects is that raises blood sugar levels.
Yep.
Right.
That's one of the main purposes of it.
Yeah,
Get that blood sugar level up.
It's trying to raise it so that you have the resources that are going to be adequate to dealing with whatever danger has been presented to you. Exactly. But you hit on this earlier, which is when that response becomes chronified and we start to live within that state, that system, it starts to kind of diminish. And you can only live in this elevated glucose response and trauma response for so long before you start to cause effects. And you'll start to alter insulin receptor sensitivity. and the body's ability to deal with the elevated glucose levels. And so maybe you even have elevated glucose, but your body can't get it into the cells adequately anymore because you become resistant because it was. So there's just, you just can't, our body wasn't designed to sustain those levels of kind of trauma preparation for that long without starting to degrade over time.
Yeah, I talk about the stress response as a sprint. How long can you sprint? Because it's not indefinite. And yet we live as if it should be sustainable. We live as if, no, I can keep this pace forever. No, your body's not designed to do that. And when we are trying to do that, it will reach that exhaustion phase and we will start to see things like the insulin resistance. So that is also another biomarker that I have started to use to measure the degree of a biology of trauma, or how much that trauma has impacted one's biology because of decades of living this way. Because that is a shift that measures really duration of time as well as the degree of stress and trauma that a person has been impacted in their body.
Yeah, 100%. It's a fascinating thing, this trauma. And I think, if you get into this concept of, okay, well, how do you short circuit that? I guess that in part brings us kind of full circle back to dopamine, right?
Right.
Yeah. There's a lot of kind of pre-programmed responses that we just default into because of the trauma. And so you don't even have to think about it anymore. It becomes kind of an automatic thought that just occurs, and you don't even have to go through consciously this scenario of kind of this kind of metaphorical doom scrolling that occurs within the prefrontal cortex, because the end of it is everyone's better off without me. I'm the worst. And you don't have to think about steps 2 through 35. Step 1 happens and the brain instantly experiences step 36, which is despair and hopelessness and all these things that kind of jump in there. And so dopamine becomes this critical neurotransmitter to starting to change the way that our body unconsciously jumps to terrible conclusions and experiences hopelessness from what should be kind of non-noxious stimuli, but then they elicit this cascade of despair that really predicts danger and problem, but it's not quite firing the way we want it to.
Right. Yeah, it's making me think of the research study done by Seligman, the psychologist back in the 1960s, with learned helplessness. And he placing the dogs in the container with the electrical shock, tying half of them to the wall with their harnesses, shocking them, having half of the group be able to jump and half of them not being able to jump. And then in subsequent times, he would put all the dogs, none of them were tied up now, but only the dogs that had been able to jump the first time would jump now. The dogs who had been tied up the first time, they didn't even try, even though they could have now. They laid down on the mat and they just whimpered.
Yeah. And that's a dopaminergically learned behavior.
Right.
Because even that electric shock causes a release of dopamine in the brain.
Yep.
And so those poor little dogs, they sat there and they learned from that experience, and it changed their perception. And so unconsciously it led to this lack of action, right? And so, boy, here's an interesting little, the dopamine of the arithmetic of dopamine is another interesting little concept that comes up with a study like this, because and this won't be perfect, so bear with me here, but it seems that it's something on the order of about a 10-to-1 the potency of a negative experience to a positive one in terms of dopamine. In other words, and maybe to make it more digestible here, if you get up and give a speech and that speech goes well, that's a reinforcing experience. You think, oh, that's good. Okay, I did well. And you might give 5 or 6 good speeches, but then you give up and give one bad one. And the feedback from that one bad one is more potent than the 6 ones that you gave that went beautifully, even though you got all the best feedback in the world, but that one experience is more potent.
It's
than
so
those six
true.
combined.
And I can think of that one in my mind right now.
Right. And there's lots of these, right? This happens in our relationships.
Yeah.
It happens at work. And there's an evolution. I mean, there's a reason for this. It's because in part, we're trying to avoid danger, and so often negativity is more associated with danger than is positivity. But it tells you a little bit about how we should be interacting with the people around us. I think there's a little bit to glean from this in terms of how we behave, because if you want to help someone and you want to love someone and you want someone to be moving in a positive direction, you've got to provide an environment and a source for them where they can make 10 to 11 to 12 to 15 positive predictions for every one negative one that's made. And that, I think, is a critical little piece of humanity. And it's part of why I think, most of the really great programs out there, they really help people's minds shift to focusing on putting their trust into things that become unchangeable. That's a critical piece to this, because if my self-worth and what I'm basing myself off of is what other people think of me, or it's based upon the accolades that I get from my work, or it's based upon my pet, or even based upon my spouse. And I love my wife. I mean, I couldn't, I mean, she's the greatest thing that ever happened to me. But she might die tomorrow. And if everything that I am is only built in changeable things, then we potentially could have a bit of an issue. And so anchoring ourselves from a dopamine perspective into those things that are unchangeable becomes so important. That my worth is dependent on my relationship with God, for example, or my worth is dependent on things that I can control. I can choose whether I'm going to be kind to someone. I can choose whether I'm going to be patient. Those are things that fall within my control. And even if everything else in my life falls apart, I can still choose to be kind. I can still choose to think well of an individual and to be patient and to serve someone. I can choose to pray. I can choose to anchor these things in kind of this unchangeable way. And in some sense, you could say that the architecture of our brain, it was designed to interact in these ways, to anchor itself to things that become unchangeable, because we've got to be able to look to something that doesn't change in order to get the consistent feedback that's going to be sufficient to overcome the arithmetic of dopamine that's associated with negative trauma and some of these other aspects. And so in my experience, overcoming some of that stuff, it requires that we go to something. And for me, that's God, right? That we look to that and we find this unchangeable thing that allows us to be anchored, and that we can move to like that. But I think that's another critical piece of dopamine.
That is such a critical piece. And I think it's often not even known, so it's not brought into programs. But, as you're bringing this really important concept, I'm reminded of the number one reason why my patients would relapse on their substance. And it was always change.
Yeah.
Something changed. It was usually a loss, a change. They got fired. There was something where they had kind of latched on to, like, this means I'm going to be okay. And then that changes, whether that's a person, a place, a thing. Change was the number one reason why they relapsed on their substance. And then I think about childhood, right? And there's many people who are like, my childhood was fine. I didn't have any trauma. And then we look at their childhood and just the change that they had. They didn't live in the same place. They moved. They were military, maybe. They moved from school to school to school. But my parents were good parents. But there's so much more that goes into the stability that our brain needs in order to form these kinds of neural pathways that then allows us to have that sense of, this is my strong footing. This is my center. This is my ground that I can stand on. And when I stand on that, I can withstand other changes because I have this centering me. And for many people, hopefully that becomes some aspect of spirituality. The people who don't have that, they struggle, Dr. Bills. They really struggle.
Yeah.
Because we need that sense of balance, stability, and grounding. And that's a big part of dopamine.
Yeah, there's a, I mean, long ago, like there's an old saying that, the wise person built their home upon a foundation of stone, right? And the unwise person built it upon the sand. And I think in some sense, we've got to have an anchor that is unchangeable. Like that's got to be the core. Or we're setting up our mesolimbic dopamine system to wreak havoc on our perception of reality. And it's interesting that some of that age-old wisdom is just simply true. That those unchangeable things are just critical pieces, and it's rare when someone doesn't have an anchor in an unchangeable thing that they're going to move past some of those hard traumas and kind of get there. Because like you said, if my anchor becomes my job, or my anchor becomes what other people think of me, or my anchor becomes my pet, and don't get me wrong, those are wonderful things. I'm not suggesting we wouldn't have those things. Those are great things. We should have that. But even going out, like I've known people that were trying to get through addiction, and the way they did it was they would hike and they would exercise. That's great. We did a series of studies years ago where we actually looked at the effects of different intensities exercise on the dopamine system and how it affects these drugs. It's wonderful. But the problem is some of them got injured. And then all of a sudden they couldn't exercise anymore and everything fell apart.
That was my story. That was 2014 for me. Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's heartbreaking. It's so difficult. And so you just can't overemphasize the importance of finding an unchangeable anchor that we base this on.
Yeah. Love that. This has been an amazing conversation, as we knew it would be, Dr. Bills. What's next for you for research? What are you working on?
Man, we are in the throes of, well, we got I think we've got 15, 16 projects that are going on.
Of course.
We're very interested in migraine. That's a passion. We run the migraine and neuro rehab center here at the Nordic College in Provo, Utah. And so that's never going away. We're going to be trying to understand chronic migraine for years. And so we're doing a lot of work right now looking at the effects of a ketogenic diet and how we can reset insulin receptor sensitivity in migraine patients. We're working a lot right now on trying to understand how continuous biometric feeds, everything from continuous EKGs, respiration rate, O2 sats, heart rate variability, continuous glucose monitoring, how those feeds can be used to build a more comprehensive profile of someone's health. We're doing a lot of work trying to understand how we've got some projects where we're trying to develop some mathematical models to do decompositions of electroencephalograms, EEGs, and then feed those back into transcranial magnetic stimulation devices to do kind of real-time neuromodulation. So lots of good projects. I would say migraine and behavioral health, though, those are probably the ones that we love the most.
Well, as soon as you're ready to take that and translate it into trauma healing, you know where to find me. And all of my people, I'm sure, will be very happy to participate in studies, because this is what we do. This is what we do in looking at the biometrics, the markers, the objective data to gain so much deeper insights about how we are being more precise, how we can be more personalized, and pace at the right pace that our body needs to for the trauma healing. So thank you for your time, and thank you for the work that you do in the world.
Well, thank you for having me. It was absolutely a pleasure, and thank you for all the work you're doing.
You'll find links in the show notes to Dr. Kyle Bills and his research. I will even include the link to the dopamine seek that I have purchased and use regularly. If you're interested in using your specific metabolics, neurochemistry, and biometrics to accelerate your emotional and nervous system healing, you will want to consider joining the year-long program with me after your foundational journey. This is a year of biology of trauma immersion, the coursework on stress, grief, attachment, letting go, freeze, and neuroplasticity, along with being in a small, trusted tribe, and coaching by me and my team for the year. All the pieces, somatic, parts, biology, all together. There is both a track for self-help individuals and those who are practitioners and want the year-long training to become a biology trauma professional. It's this kind of precision with biochemistry, metabolics, and biometrics that allows us to accomplish more, faster, not by pushing and working harder, but by being more precise, personalized, and pacing it for what we need. If you want more of this kind of thing, you will want to check out episodes 5 and 6. That was with Dr. William Walsh. Those were released on January 6, 2023 and December 30, 2022. And we went into the genetics and epigenetics and neurochemistry of so much of trauma being stored in the body. I'm your host, Dr. Aimie. Until next episode, lots of love.